To our political panel now here in Los Angeles, Dave Jacobson and John Thomas. Dave, first to you. If nothing else, this statement from the White House is a lot more nuanced than what we've heard previously from President Trump. And nuance and Donald Trump don't often go together in the same sentence.
He's normally quite blunt.
Yeah.
He's singing a different tune, and I think it raises real questions about what his calculus is, what he's doing sort of behind the scenes, what conversations perhaps he's having with the prime minister that he's not having with the public. But this is a different tune for sure than what we saw on the campaign trail, where he excoriated the Obama administration for their support or their opposition, pardon me, to the new settlements. But I do think it's noteworthy the fact that right after Donald Trump was elected president, there was an announcement of new settlements that were moving forward. So I guess the question is, like, how do they pivot and sort of figure out what this peace process is going to look like moving forward?
John, any coincidence this more traditional approach to foreign policy came on the first full working day of the new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson?
Not at all. In fact, last night, John, I was sitting here.
I know, that's why I asked the question.
Saying Rex Tillerson, Rex Tillerson.
Rex will save us all. Rex will fix everything.
And we're seeing it in action. You know, Rex is being a diplomat. I mean, that's what he's saying. Now, the question is, when Trump gets behind a microphone, does he use that same language, or is he more blunt and kind of the tough-talking Trump that we're familiar with? I think that's going to be the struggle. But so far, so good.
Yeah, right. We know that Tillerson did speak with Netanyahu, or at least officials within the Israeli government. So east of the White House expressing concern about Israeli settlements, now also talking new sanctions on Iran. It's sounding a lot like the Obama administration.
Very much so, John. And on the question of Iran, U.S. President Donald Trump says nothing, it seems, is off the table when it comes to that country. Not even military action, it seems. The White House is expected to slap new sanctions on Tehran over its latest ballistic missile test. A senior Iranian advisor dismissed what he called Mr. Trump's baseless rantings and said even Americans aren't satisfied with Trump's extremists. Take a listen.
Nothing is off the table. I haven't eased anything.
Well, let's get more on this. New York Times correspondent Thomas Erdbrink joins me now from Tehran. And Thomas, yesterday we heard the president say that Iran was on notice. Today, expectations of new sanctions. How is that being received in Tehran?
Well, obviously, the representatives of Iran's leadership have voiced their displeasure with this big change in the United States. Of course, if you look at the relation between Iran and the United States over the past year, I think the Iranians were quite pleased that a certain status quo, if you will, had been established. The Americans didn't really push the Iranians that hard, and at the same time, the Iranians were able to both shout, if you will, death to America during the Friday prayers, but also strike a $16 billion deal with U.S. plane maker Boeing. So to see now the new administration coming in this hard is a big surprise for many people within Iran's leadership.
Thomas Erdbrink is there from Tehran in Iran. Thanks very much, Thomas. John, back to you.
Okay, back to Dave and John here. So, John, military options on the table when it comes to Iran. Obama said that. New sanctions on Iran. Obama did that too. Is there a realization now when it comes to Iran, there are only just so many options for any administration?
Yes, with the exception of Obama not only allowed them to start spinning centrifuges again, which they weren't prior allowed to do, Obama also gave them hundreds of millions of dollars, of which they can spend on any nefarious activity. So now Trump's forced with how does he roll that back? And you're right, his hands are tied, but I think we're going to continue to see tough talk from Trump. The question is, will he end up taking action beyond talk?
Yeah, they were spinning the centrifuges anyway, and the money was owed to them, of course, of a court decision.
Yeah, but they're bad actors.
Okay.
But I think it came off as more of like a knee-jerk reaction, right? The question is, like, did he collaborate and have any conversations with some of our allies that we went in on the Iran nuclear deal with, right? Like, were there any conversations with some of our European allies who have a vested interest in making sure that Iran doesn't have, you know, a bomb moving forward or doesn't, you know, send out any missiles? And I think those are real questions in terms of the diplomatic dynamic, right? Like, is he having conversations with our allies, or is it more of the sort of go-it-alone approach?
John, this is for you. I want to read some more of Thomas's reporting. The reporter from the New York Times. This is the reaction in Tehran to Donald Trump. But there is little doubt that the clerics have been thrown off balance. One analyst with access to government deliberations said that hardliners in Iran were confused and did not know how to deal with the situation. Some in the establishment are opting for the same rhetoric and tactics they used under Mr. Obama, but in reality, this is uncharted territory. So this is the Richard Nixon madman strategy when it comes to foreign policy? seems to be working, at least for now.
He has to retrain Iran. Over the last 8 years, they could pretty much get away with anything. In fact, they're a lot richer than they were before. So we'll see if it works. I think Trump understands that he can't let Iran bully him around. The problem is, if Iran pushes back, at what point does Trump actually send troops in? Or
where is that red line?
And the question is, like, is there an appetite among the American public to go and have another war? We're already in 2 wars at this point,
do we need a third?
Right.
Okay, so Issa, from possible sanctions for Iran and now modification of existing sanctions on Russia.
Very much so, John. It's coming from the U.S. Treasury Department. It is saying it is making easier for some companies to do limited business with Russia's Federal Security Service, the former KGB. The State Department calls it, and I'm quoting here, a technical fix. And President Donald Trump insists it's not an easing of sanctions. Meantime, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley made her first appearance at the Security Council on Thursday, which seems very tough talk for Russia.
The United States continues to condemn and call for an immediate end to the Russian occupation of Crimea. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Our Crimea-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns control over the peninsula to Ukraine.
Let's bring in CNN's Claire Sebastian, who joins us now from Moscow. And Claire, so the U.S. Treasury Department modifying sanctions on Russia's main intelligence agency. These adjustments, what do they mean, and how is that being received by Russian President Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, Issa, so this is a small technical fix to part of that wave of sanctions that the Obama administration brought in December. This was not due to Ukraine. This was actually due to alleged Russian interference in the U.S. elections. And part of that was to slap a blanket sanction on the FSB, the Russian State Security Agency. And that had the unintended consequence, according to the U.S. Treasury, of preventing some legitimate business by U.S. companies in Russia, because one of the duties of the FSB is to provide licenses for import and distribution of certain technologies that these companies wanted to sell in Russia. So this basically carves out a loophole that allows a limited amount of that activity to take place, up to $5,000 worth a year per company. As for how this is being received in Russia, we saw an initial kind of burst of optimism. The ruble spiked a little bit. It now seems to have subsided. Most Russian media reports are referring to this as an easing or softening of sanctions, despite the fact that both Treasury and the U.S. president say that that's not what this is. As for the Kremlin, a more muted reaction, though. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, telling CNN's Matthew Chance yesterday, quote, "We care, but not that much." And certainly those comments from Nikki Haley overnight condemning Russian action in Ukraine serve to dampen the mood a little bit here when it comes to a potential rapprochement with the United States, Issa.
Very much so. Claire Sebastian there for us in Moscow. Thanks very much, Claire. John?
Well, OK, Dave and John. So, Dave, firstly, back to those comments that Nikki Haley made at the UN, not quite Samantha Power, but certainly much more forceful than, I guess, what we had expected coming from this administration, given the history with Russia.
Absolutely. I mean, it is relatively promising when after months and months, I mean, Donald Trump really hasn't said anything negative against Vladimir Putin, one of America's staunchest adversaries historically. And what I found fascinating was this sort of juxtaposition where he's been hugging Vladimir Putin, but at the same time alienating our allies, whether it's Mexico or just yesterday, Australia, European leaders. And so this dynamic is fascinating. But Nikki Haley's comments, nonetheless, were promising. Yeah,
John, one of these, I'm going back to the issue of modification of the sanctions. This is one of these moments when Democrats seem to jump the gun. They set their hair on fire, they run around calling this was a reward for bad behavior. Here's one example from Democrat Congressman Eric Swalwell from here in California. Russia attacked our democracy. It should be punished. Instead, President Trump is easing sanctions against its team of hackers, the FSB. This turned out to be a great big fat nothing burger.
Yeah, well, I think the Democrats are looking for opportunities to make a substantial point against Donald Trump. The media has largely been doing their job for them, and here's something where they want there to be a there against Russia. They want that to become part of the narrative. You're right, it's nothing at this point. It doesn't mean, you're right, in my opinion, Trump is going to have to be even tougher on Russia than he has been. I think Trump visioned his role as somebody who gets along with everybody, but there are some people out there, like Iran, like Russia, that are bad actors. So Democrats have to tread lightly, but so does Donald Trump.
Well, but let's not forget, and let's not minimize the fact that, like, Republicans also are infuriated by the Russian hacking, right? So, like, I mean, there's senators and House members that are going to call and continue to call for a thorough and deep investigation of the Russian hacking.
Okay, so we know that Donald Trump likes to get on with many world leaders, Russia's Vladimir Putin. He's also trying to mend fences with the Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, after that heated telephone call over the weekend. Issa, you have more details on that.
Very much so, John. The cleanup, it seems, continues after President Trump's call with Australia's Prime Minister, you were mentioning there, Joe Hockey. Australia's ambassador to the US met top administration officials on Thursday. The White House says the meeting was productive and conveyed the president's deep admiration for the Australian people. Well, earlier this week, if you remember, Mr. Trump and Malcolm Turnbull had a heated phone call over a US pledge to take refugees from Australia. Political reporter Shalila Medora is in Canberra with more. And Shalila, after that bruising, I think it's fair to say, public spat between President Trump and Prime Minister Turnbull, where do things stand? Are there fears there about the future of US agreement to resettle refugees?
Absolutely, yes. There is a genuine concern here about the future of the US and the Australian alliance. I mean, to give you an insight into what it's like here, our relationship with the US is considered one of our most rock solid. Around 8 out of 10 Australians support the ANZUS Treaty and think it's a vital part of our relationship with the US. But a lot of that support is contingent on who the leader of the US is. Something like 77% of Australians in a pre-election poll supported Hillary Clinton. So there is that idea that this phone call and news of this phone call was like a slight on the Australian and US alliance. And there are real questions now, particularly in this place in Parliament House, about what it will mean for this rock-solid relationship.
Shalila Medora there for us in Canberra. Thanks very much, Australia. John, back to you.
Okay, Issa, so Donald Trump pretty much confirmed that he did have these heated telephone conversations, not just with the Australian Prime Minister, but also with the Mexican President. This is what he said at the National Prayer Breakfast.
The world is in trouble, but we're going to straighten it out, okay? That's what I do. I fix things. We're going to straighten it out. Believe me, when you hear about the tough phone calls I'm having, don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. They're tough. We have to be tough. It's time we're going to be a little tough, folks. We're taken advantage of by every nation in the world virtually. It's not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen anymore.
Sounding a little Tony Soprano there, but James, I get what the message here is: the world is in trouble. Donald Trump will fix it. That's after he creates the turmoil in the first place.
Right, and this is the guy who knew more than the generals, right? But I thought that speech was quite insightful because he actually, at the prayer breakfast, asked everyone there to pray for Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor, because of his ratings. I mean, that's just unbelievable. Talk about an egomaniac. But look, at the end of the day, it's crazy. Anyways, I mean, but if you look at like those two countries that you mentioned, Mexicans, back in, I think it was 2006, 2005, they sent in their army after Hurricane Katrina to help Americans, to take care of Americans, okay? If you look at Australia, after September 11th, they sent their soldiers there and they sacrificed blood and treasure in Afghanistan, right? These are key allies that we need to maintain very positive relationships with, and Donald Trump is skewering America's ties to those countries.
Okay, we heard earlier from another Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. He talked about having his own disagreements in the past with US administrations. Listen to this.
But on the broader question of disagreements between the United States and Australia within this alliance, we've had stacks of them over the years. When I was Prime Minister of Australia, I came into office with President Bush, who was a strong proponent of the Iraq War. I was a bitter opponent of the war from the get-go. And we had some very testy and difficult times. So these things come and they go.
And John, the point is, though, those conversations, those dust-ups, are held in private. The public never really learn all of the dirty details like we did, you know, over the past 24 hours.
That's how things used to be done. Not anymore. I mean, presidents also didn't used to tweet their live thoughts, and now they are. We're in a new world, and the American public knew what they were getting when they voted for Donald Trump. They knew that he talked with his thumbs. Is this any surprise?
Well, I think it's also emblematic of the increasing leaks that we're seeing out of the White House. Like, that was a private conversation. There's probably one or two, maybe three other people in the room with the president. So people are clearly, there's lots of chaos and turmoil in the White House. People are jockeying for power, and people are leaking things to the press, and that's why this stuff's getting out.
Okay, thank you both for being with us. Issa, back to you.